Welcome to Analytically Delicious, Insights into Food Safety by LVA. Join us as we explore the latest developments, trends, and challenges in ensuring the safety of our food supply through analytical techniques, uncovering the science behind what makes our food safe and delicious.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Analytically Delicious, the podcast where we break down the science, stories, and secrets behind the food we eat. I'm your host, David Steiner, and today we're peeling back the layers on a topic that's as alarming as it is critical: food fraud. Imagine you're at a grocery store buying a favorite food like olive oil, honey, or fish. You trust that what's on the label is exactly what you are getting. But what if that's not always the case? That olive oil might be mixed with some cheaper oils, or the fish isn't what you think it is. This is the world of food fraud, and it's more common than you would expect. Today we have Professor Chris Elliott, founder of the Institute for Global Food Security at Queen's University in Belfast and leader of the 2013 horsemeat scandal investigation. Chris doesn't call it food fraud, but food crime, as organized criminal networks infiltrate our food supply. Chris has spent decades at the forefront of food safety research, and he's here to share his insights with us. In this episode, we will explore how these crimes happen, the impact they have on our health and confidence in the food we consume, and what's being done to combat them. So grab your headphones and let's uncover the hidden threats in our food system. So Chris, welcome to our show. It's a real pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks for the invitation, David. I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with you today.
So Chris, before we get into the heavy stuff, I have to ask, what's your guilty pleasure when it comes to food? And don't worry, we won't judge.
Yes, I guess we all have our guilty pleasure of food, David. But, for me, what I really enjoy is cooking. I cook quite a lot, and I particularly cook with my grandson. And that's one of our great pastimes at the weekend. And we cook many, many things. Sometimes our inventions work, sometimes they don't work. But I think if you want a guilty pleasure, we try to make our own ice cream and different, very strange flavors sometimes. But what we always do is we try to source everything locally, all of the ingredients, particularly the milk comes from Northern Ireland produce. We're always very careful about that.
Yeah, of course. I fully understand. So, Chris, in one of your interviews, you have mentioned the term food crime, and it is also part of the title of today's episode. So how would you define food crime, and what forms of food fraud should we be aware of?
Yes, that's a really good question, David. Actually, I have one of the lectures I used to give to my students frequently called Why I Invented Food Crime. Mm-hmm. And I really came up with the term in 2013. Mm-hmm. And that's when I was doing the investigation on the horsemeat scandal, which I know we'll talk about more in detail later on. But what I was trying to do was really convince people in the UK government it's criminal activity. This is not trivial. This is somebody who is cheating us for economic gain. It's fraud, the same way as you get financial fraud. So I was just trying to get across the seriousness of the topic. And of course, now many people in different parts of the world like to refer to it as food crime, because now there's a really strong understanding. Not only is it criminals involved, but sometimes it's organized criminal networks.
I see. Yeah, that's fascinating and actually also a bit alarming. But it's clear that food crime is a serious and a versatile issue, affecting not just what we eat, but also our trust in the entire food system, right? So, speaking of which, Chris, you are known as the man who helped unmask one of the biggest food scandals in recent history, namely the horsemeat scandal of 2013. So for those who might not remember, could you briefly explain what happened and how you got involved?
Yes, and actually I had been working on food fraud for quite a long time, David, and for various reasons, it never became a really big issue. The media didn't really think of it as a big issue. if there was an incident about food safety, sometimes yes, sometimes no, but not about fraud. But what happened this time, which made it really very different, and I do remember I was sitting at home watching the BBC News, and the breaking news story was horsemeat found in Tesco's burgers.
Mm-hmm.
And my prediction that night was, this is going to be a really big story.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I thought it was going to be very big wasn't so much about horsemeat. It was Tesco's, the world's second largest supermarket,
Mm-hmm.
were implicated in a fraud scandal. Now, what happened over the next few weeks, there was more and more testing of different meat products and more cases of the adulteration of beef was starting to emerge. And I think there was very few people had really knowledge about what was going wrong, how this might have happened. So I became quite a commentator for lots of different media outlets. It was from the BBC to Al Jazeera to CNN. Every day I was giving lots and lots of interviews. And I think the fact that I knew something about what was going on attracted the attention of the British government, because they had already announced in Parliament that they were going to have an independent review undertaken. And then lots of people were asking who was going to undertake this independent review. And I actually met with one of the senior government ministers, and we talked about this. And we agreed that I would take on the review for the UK government, and that I would be given a small team. I was given the terms of reference. And the initial thoughts were that this would take 3 to 6 months. Actually, I spent close to 1.5 years doing this, because the food system is so complex, unbelievably complex. And the value of the food system in the UK, if you include food and beverages, it's about 150 billion euros. It employed 4 million people. And what I was trying to do was investigate, how did the fraud happen? But more importantly, how do we stop that happening in the future? And as we investigated, we found more and more issues about food authenticity. So it became a really quite large-scale study, quite a large-scale report. What surprised a lot of people was the UK government actually agreed to every single recommendation that I made in my report as well. And there was a lot of work going into the implementation of those ever since. So it's been 10, 11 years now, and continually we are trying to make the UK like a fortress against fraud.
That sounds really amazing. And that report introduced the concept of the 8 pillars of food integrity, right? So, which, correct me if I'm wrong, has become somewhat of a guiding light for the industry. So could you walk us through what these pillars are and why they are so important?
Yes, thanks for that, David. And you're right. What I tried to do was not write a 1,000-page report. It was like me trying to write a standard operating procedure to combat food fraud. So the report was concise, and we kept it to those 8 guiding principles, the 8 pillars. And the first of those 8 pillars was really common sense. We always have to put consumers first. As I said, the food industry is big, big business. There is lots of money to be made, lots of money changes hands. But somewhere I thought it had been lost a little bit that consumers must trust every piece of food that we buy. We shouldn't have to think about questioning whether is this genuine, is it fake, is it safe, is it not safe. So consumers first was the first of the pillars. And the second was what I described as zero tolerance. So zero tolerance, I got the concept actually from Mayor Giuliano in New York. And it was when New York was really one of the most dangerous cities in the world. And to tackle that, the mayor of New York, Giuliano, said, we will adopt zero tolerance for all criminal activity. If you shoot somebody, we are going to come and arrest you. We are going to put you in prison. If you break a window, we're going to come and arrest you and put you in prison. And the idea was no form of criminal activity you should tolerate. And I said exactly the same thing about food. Not so much about, large scale criminal activity, but if you've got somebody tampering with your food and they think, well, this isn't going to make much difference, that is unacceptable. All forms of adulteration of food are unacceptable. So that was the second pillar. And the third was, I call intelligence gathering. And often when I talk to people about the horsemeat scandal, they said, oh, well, we could never have predicted this. This was something that nobody expected. And my answer was, exactly the same thing happened in South Africa 1 year ago. So clearly, nobody was really looking on the horizon to see what's happening. So collecting as much information as you can, and also sharing very sensitive, very commercially sensitive information across the industry and across the government was very important. Then something, of course, very close to our heart, the next pillar was about laboratory services. And the public analyst system had been formed in the UK more than 100 years previous to the horsemeat scandal. But what I found is it was really being very poorly resourced. It was contracting. The numbers of experts were available were getting lower and lower. So my really strong recommendation to the government, you must support the analysis. You must get world-leading analytical chemistry in terms of the ability to be able to detect food fraud. And then the next of the pillars was about auditing. And food businesses, particularly in Europe, I will tell you, have multiple audits. They get audited nearly every week. One company that I talked to had 3 separate audits on the same week. But the feedback was the audits were not fit for purpose. Not fit for purpose in terms of detecting fraud. And I really said to the whole auditing industry, you have to change. Fraud and food safety and compliance to regulations are very, very different. I often say also, David, criminals are generally quite stupid and get caught. Fraudsters are generally quite clever and don't get caught. They have so many ways to hide what they're doing. So my recommendation was around changing the entire audit system in terms of really thinking about fraud. The 6th of the 8 pillars was around government support. Now, what I found in the UK government, the control of the food system in the UK was unbelievably complicated. Many different government departments all had a role in it. And I think that's the same in most parts of the world, really. But what I found is the government departments were quite unconnected with each other, totally working in isolation. And actually, when the horsemeat scandal broke in the UK, no government department was willing to take responsibility. So it was really government, you've got to come work together, get all of the elements of the food system to come together. And that really leads on to the penultimate of my pillars, and that's about leadership. And there was nobody willing to take a leadership role in the horsemeat scandal for a very long period of time. On the television, I could see actually government ministers from the same political party arguing with each other about who was responsible. So I said, in terms of the next crisis, immediately we need to know who's going to lead things, have that leadership role. And that really brings on my last is about crisis management. It is government's responsibility to manage crises, national crises, but it's also the responsibility of the food industry, of course, as well. Now, what I found was, and there was no plan in the UK to manage a serious food fraud crisis. and there is now. So really, those are the kind of 8 sections of my standard operating procedure, and a lot of those recommendations have been implemented in a really, really positive way.
That's really great. And to sum it up at this point, so these pillars are about building a food system based on integrity, one that ensures food safety, human nutrition, sustainability, ethics, and respect. And the pillars aim to create a system which is resilient to the kind of shocks we have seen in the horsemeat scandal, for example. So speaking of shocks, we have had also a few lately, namely the COVID-19 crisis, the current war in Ukraine, and also the ongoing climate crisis. So how have these events impacted global food security, and do you think they have made us more vulnerable to food fraud?
Yes, I mean, you list some of the shocks, major shocks we have had to the food system in a very short space of time, David. And they are putting massive strains on the global food supply system, massive strains on particular supply chains as well. But when we think about this, that the biggest single shock is our changing climate. That will have the greatest impact in terms of feeding the world's population. It will have the biggest impact in terms of future food safety risks, but also the biggest single impact on fraud, because we will have more and more shortages. And whenever there's a shortage of something, it is the paradise of fraudsters. There are so many different ways that people can cheat, particularly when there's a shortage of something. And a lot of my warnings to governments and businesses in many different parts of the world is understand where the major shortages will be in particular commodities and ingredients. And that's where you should focus your efforts in terms of safety and fraud, because that's where they will appear more and more often. And I can already see examples of that happening, where there's a particular crop failure in one part of the world. Suddenly we pick up reports of more fraud. The Ukraine war is a great example of that. Ukraine, one of the big producers of sunflower oil, for instance, massive shortage of sunflower oil, and then right across the world for the next 6-12 months, all I saw was more and more reports of adulterated vegetable oil. So it's just a good example of what can happen whenever there's shortages.
That's pretty unsettling. And so in such a complex and often unclear global food network, how do we go about detecting these instances of fraud? Is it all down to high-tech lab work, or are there other methods in play?
Of course, my answer to that should be it's all down to lab work. And you would probably agree with me, David. But of course, having good analytical methods is a very important part of the process, but there are many other important parts as well. I talked about audits, inspections. Those are incredibly important, that are fraud aware, that you have people who are trained to detect fraud. Also, visibility of supply chains is really important. The world's food supply system is incredibly opaque. Generally, one company will know where they source a particular commodity or ingredient from, but they don't know where that had come from. And that leaves massive opportunities for fraud. So supply chain mapping is something that I preach regularly. Companies must map their supply chains. And then in these very complex supply chains, or actually I prefer to call them supply networks, you will find the nodes in that network that are most vulnerable to fraud. And that's where you put your resources. That's where you do the auditing. That's where you take your samples for testing as well. And I think just one other thing is that sharing of information, the sharing of knowledge. Now, as part of my recommendations to the UK government, the FIN network was set up. FIN stands for the Food Industry Intelligence Network. That now is more than 80 of the UK and some of the world's largest food companies, retail, food service, manufacturing, have come together and they share all of their analytical testing data on food authenticity. And that program put together, there's more than 50,000 tests performed by the UK food industry each year for food authenticity, and that knowledge is shared amongst all of them. And then very quickly, looking at that data, you can see where the red lights are, where something is starting to appear.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm also curious now, what role do consumers actually play in this? So should consumers try to identify possible fraud in the food they buy, and what measures should they take to prevent buying fraudulently produced and possibly unsafe food?
Yes, thanks, David, again. And that's a question I get asked quite often. What is the responsibility of us as consumers? And actually what I say, first of all, it is government's responsibility in terms of looking after our security. And that can be national security, water security, food security. So it is absolutely fundamental importance that food fraud is a governmental responsibility, but also shared with the food industry. Now, how could we as consumers walk into a supermarket, a cafe, or a restaurant and start to question, is this genuine? Is it really organic? Has this come from this particular country? If we get to that stage, I think we're in serious problems. Consumers must trust our food industry and must also trust our government to deliver food security and food authenticity. There is a but to this. If we are offered something which seems to be very, very cheap, much, much cheaper than you can buy in another store, we have to question, why is it so cheap? So I always say, let's just use our common sense. If somebody is offering you something at an apparently very low cost, it's probably not genuine and it's potentially not safe. Don't buy it.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. But Chris, let's shift gears for a moment. You founded the Institute for Global Food Security at Queen's University in Belfast. What inspired you to start this institute, and what are some of the key areas of research you are focusing on now?
Yes, I mean, the Institute was formally formed 11 years ago, but it was a project I had spent another 7 years before that working on. So it's 18 years work and effort. And when I came to Queen's University, what I wanted to do was something that would have a very big impact locally to support our really fantastic food industry, but also something that would have a big impact globally as well. So I always said the Institute had two faces, one looking inwards to our local industry, but one looking outwards to the global food supply system. And I came up with three key research themes. The first was looking at farming of the future. And that is in the context of our changing climate, of all of these different challenges that we've already talked about. How can we use science and technology to produce food in more abundance, in a safer way, but also in terms of sustainability, in terms of ethics. The second big focus was around food integrity, and that was really around trying to understand how food safety risks occur, how food fraud risks occur, not only identify them through nice science and technology, but to come up with measures of preventing those incidents, the crisis happening in the future. And the third scheme was around what I called nutrition for the 21st century. And I think it surprises many people, David, that in our world today, we have a population of about 8 billion people. 2 billion of those people are obese, and a further 2 billion people suffer from what's called hidden hunger. And hidden hunger is really having a nutritionally bad diet. And so those were the three key themes that I started, and that was in 2013. But this year, I've actually moved on from the Institute for Global Food Security. I don't work there anymore. And like all good institutes, they're currently rethinking what the focus of the research should be for the future. But if they don't concentrate on those three key themes, I think it will be going backwards, not forwards. But what I do now, and I have a huge amount of fun, is I now do a lot of work in Southeast Asia, developing, guess what, a new centre for food security, headquartered in Thailand, but for the whole Southeast Asia region. And we're now coming up with our research priorities there. And that is very much about how climate is changing, impacting sustainability, impacting food safety, and impacting food authenticity. So you can see the theme really stays very strong.
And it sounds like incredibly important work, and that's why you have also received numerous accolades, including being named a BBC Food and Farming Game Changer of the Year, and also being honored with the Order of the British Empire. Chris, what do these recognitions mean to you personally?
Well, whenever you work in science for a long time, like I have, I'm in my fifth decade now, believe it or not, David, which is a bit worrying when I say it. So it's always nice to get accolades and collect medals. They are nice. They give you a nice feeling. They give your family a nice feeling. But I think more importantly, so for instance, the award from the BBC, that's special to me because that's not about really being a good scientist. That is being somebody who is able to connect and explain very complex things to the general public. And I really like doing that. I really adore these types of conversations. So yes, collecting awards is nice, but I think what is much more important is thinking about what has been the impact of your research. Have you really helped to make food safer? Have you really helped to make it more genuine? So those are the landmarks that I look for.
So before we wrap up, Chris, if you had to give just one piece of advice to policymakers, businesses and consumers alike to combat food fraud, what would it be?
That's your last question is probably the most difficult. And I will try to be as concise as possible. I think for governments have many problems to deal with. Every day there's a new problem. But do not forget the importance of food security. Do not forget the importance of food safety, and do not forget the importance of food fraud, because that can undermine the entire confidence in your food system. And I will always quote the example of China. Whenever China had the melamine crisis, it caused a disaster in terms of illness and deaths, but it also caused massive mistrust in the entire government of China. Now, the president of China, Xi Jinping, he often talks about food security. He often talks about food safety in his major speeches. And that's always to reassure the Chinese population that the government is working for them. In terms of the food industry, again, many challenges. And a lot of the challenges now are about sourcing. And I spend a lot of my time working on food systems resilience now, resilience to all of these different shocks. But do not forget that in all of these issues about resilience, people will be trying to cheat. Don't forget that. And I think for consumers, I think particularly in Europe, we can say we've actually got a really good food system. And we have fantastic infrastructure, great laboratories doing lots of testing, good connectivity. So we're in a very good position. And I think, that's something we should be very grateful for. Some of the projects that I work in, Southeast Asia and particularly Sub-Saharan Africa, my goodness, the shocks of some of the scandals that should be breaking there but aren't are quite serious. And finally, just to say that actually very soon we're going to launch a really new major project in Europe, and that is to form what we call a community of practice on food authenticity. And that's to bring all of the stakeholders together, all of those people you talked about, government agencies, industry, consumers together to understand the issues about food fraud better, to understand the issues of criminality, and collectively to try to work to make it more and more difficult for the bad actors to actually operate in our food system. So will there be more news coming about that project very soon? It's something I'm very excited about.
Yeah, me too. And really looking forward to this project in the future. So, Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and for the important work you continue to do in the field of food security.
Well, thank you for that, David. And again, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today.
If you found today's conversation as enlightening as we did and want to stay informed about future episodes, remember to subscribe to our podcast on Spotify or YouTube. By subscribing, you'll never miss a bite of our delicious insights into food safety and analysis. And for those of you with burning questions or lingering curiosities related to our today's episode or any other food safety topic, don't hesitate to contact service at lva.at. Your questions will be addressed either directly in our next episode or by our team of experts on our website, www.lva.at. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, stay safe and stay informed.